It starts with a shadow, not a sound, not a warning, just a shape that steps out from between the trees and fills the path completely. 7 feet tall, 150 pounds of muscle, bone, and ancient instinct. A bird that has been walking this earth, more or less unchanged, for millions of years. A bird that does not flinch, does not back down, and does not understand what it means to be afraid of you. 2 tourists standing on a rainforest path in far north Queensland had no idea what was waiting for them around that bend. And when they saw it, when those small, burning eyes locked onto them from beneath that great blue head and that towering casque of bone, every instinct they had was telling them to run. But they couldn't run, because behind them, without either of them noticing, a second cassowary had come out of the bush and cut off the only way back. They were boxed in. Ahead, one of the most dangerous birds on the planet. Behind them, another. And on either side of the narrow path, dense, impenetrable rainforest wall. Nowhere to go, nowhere to hide. Just 2 people standing in the green half-light of one of the oldest forests on Earth, trying not to breathe too loud, trying not to move, trying to figure out how they were going to survive the next 10 minutes. This is that story, and if you want to understand it properly, you have to go back much further than that afternoon. You have to go back to the beginning of the cassowary itself, because this is not just a story about 2 frightened tourists on a walking track. This is a story about what happens when modern human beings wander into a world that was never built for them, into an ecosystem so old and so complete that they are, by every biological measure, the outsiders. If you've ever thought of birds as fragile, delicate things, as creatures that exist at the edges of your world without ever posing a real threat to it, then what you're about to learn is going to change the way you think about them entirely. And if you're new here, if this is the first time you've stumbled onto this channel, make sure you subscribe right now, because this is exactly the kind of story we tell here. Stories where nature doesn't perform for you, doesn't soften its edges, doesn't wait for you to feel comfortable. Stories where the world reveals itself for what it actually is. Now, let's go back into that rainforest. The Daintree is not like other forests. You feel that the moment you step inside it, the air is different, heavier, and wetter, and older somehow, as if the atmosphere itself remembers what it was like before the world was the way it is now. The Daintree rainforest in far north Queensland is one of the oldest continuously existing tropical rainforests on the planet. Some estimates put its age at over 180 million years. To give you a sense of what that means, this forest existed before the first flowering plants appeared on Earth. It was already ancient when the dinosaurs were rising. It watched them rise, and it watched them fall, and when they were gone, it kept growing. The plants here are not like the plants you know from gardens or parks, or even from other forests. The trees have roots that arch above the ground like the ribs of some buried creature. Ferns grow as tall as houses. The canopy above you is so thick that on a clear day, you might walk for an hour in something close to twilight, the sunlight broken into shafts and fragments long before it reaches you. And the sounds. The sounds are constant, layered, a shifting collage of calls and rustles and drips and movements that you will never quite be able to trace to their source. The forest is always doing something. You are never quite alone inside it. And that is not a comforting thought. It is into this world that the cassowary belongs. Not as a visitor, not as one species among many competing for space. The cassowary is, in a very real sense, an architect of this ecosystem. Without it, the forest would not be what it is. And that fact alone tells you something profound about the kind of animal you are dealing with. There are 3 species of cassowary in the world: the dwarf cassowary, the northern cassowary, and the southern cassowary. The one you are most likely to encounter in Queensland, the one that was waiting on that path, is the southern cassowary, Cassowarius cassowarius. It is the largest of the 3 and the second heaviest bird on Earth after the ostrich. A large female, and females are bigger than males, can stand close to 2 meters tall and weigh up to 70 kilograms. She has a body covered in coarse, double-shafted black feathers that shed rain like a waterproof coat. Her neck and head are bare, the skin a vivid, almost electric blue that deepens into purple and then into red at the back of the neck, where 2 long wattles hang like decorations. And on top of her head, rising from the skull like a crown, the casque, a hard, bony protrusion made of keratin and bone that can reach 15 centimeters in height. Its exact purpose is still debated among scientists. Some believe it helps the bird push through dense vegetation. Others think it plays a role in sound transmission, helping the bird hear and produce the low, deep, rumbling calls that travel through the forest floor. Some suggest it is used in dominance displays. Whatever its purpose, it gives the bird an appearance unlike anything else alive, ancient, armored, utterly alien. But it is not the casque that makes the cassowary dangerous. Look down. Each of the cassowary's 3 toes ends in a claw. The inner toe carries a dagger-like talon that can reach 12 centimeters in length, 12 centimeters of keratin, straight, hard, and sharp enough to open a wound in a single kick that a surgeon would have to spend significant time closing. And the cassowary doesn't just scratch with this claw, it kicks. It leaps and drives both feet forward simultaneously, the way a kangaroo does when cornered, and those 12-centimeter blades go into whatever is in front of it with the full force of a 150-pound body behind them. A kick from a cassowary has enough power to disembowel a person. This has happened. It is documented. It is not a theoretical risk. It is a real one. In 1926, a 16-year-old boy in Queensland named Philip McLean was kicked by a cassowary he had been chasing on his family's property. He fell to the ground. The bird kicked him again, this time at the throat. He died of the wound. He is still the only person known to have been killed by a cassowary in recorded history, but the number of serious injuries caused by these birds runs into the dozens, and most wildlife authorities in Australia will tell you that the actual number is probably much higher, because not all encounters get reported, and not all of them end in hospital visits dramatic enough to make it into official records. The Guinness World Records lists the cassowary as the world's most dangerous bird. This is not hyperbole. This is the result of a cold-eyed assessment of the physical capabilities of the animal and the documented history of what it has done to people when it felt threatened or cornered. Now you need to understand something about why these birds are the way they are. Because the cassowary is not aggressive by nature. It is not a predator. It doesn't hunt, doesn't pursue, doesn't go looking for trouble. The cassowary is, at its core, a shy, reclusive animal that spends most of its life moving quietly through the forest, eating fruit, and doing the essential ecological work that the rainforest depends on it for. The cassowary is what ecologists call a keystone species. It is one of the very few animals large enough and durable enough to eat the giant fruits that fall from the rainforest's tallest trees, fruits with thick husks, hard seeds, bitter flesh, fruits that would simply rot on the forest floor if not for the cassowary, which swallows them whole and walks, sometimes for kilometers, before depositing the seeds in its droppings, intact and ready to germinate. Scientists have identified over 150 plant species in the Daintree, whose seeds are dispersed primarily by cassowaries. 150. Remove the cassowary, and you don't just lose a bird, you trigger a cascade of ecological collapse. You lose the plants, and the insects that depend on the plants, and the birds and reptiles and mammals that depend on the insects, and on, until the forest is something fundamentally different from what it is now. The cassowary has been doing this work for roughly 60 million years. It was here, carrying seeds through the forest, when Australia was still attached to Antarctica. It is not exaggerating to say that the Daintree rainforest, as it exists today, is partly a creation of the cassowary. The bird built the forest, and you have walked into it. The tourists who found themselves cornered on that path in Queensland had done everything right by the standards of most visitors to the region. They had entered one of the designated walking tracks in the area around the Daintree. They had a map. They had water. They had told someone where they were going. They were not reckless people doing reckless things. They were a couple in their 30s, experienced enough hikers to know that the Daintree demanded respect, careful enough to stay on marked trails, sensible enough not to approach wildlife. What they had not accounted for, what almost no one accounts for until it happens to them, is the speed and the silence with which a cassowary can materialize from the undergrowth. These birds, despite their size, are extraordinarily quiet when they want to be. They move through dense vegetation with a fluid, practiced ease that belies their bulk. The double-shafted feathers, stiff and hair-like rather than soft and veined like most bird feathers, part the bush without catching or snagging. The bird's feet, though large, land with a precision and a lightness that produces almost no sound on the forest floor. And the colors that should make it stand out, the blue, the red, the glossy black, somehow don't. In the dappled, shifting light of the rainforest interior, a cassowary can be invisible at 10 meters. They had been walking for about 40 minutes when the first bird appeared. They came around a gentle bend in the path, and there it was, standing in the middle of the track, perhaps 8 meters ahead, completely still, regarding them with that particular quality of attention that large animals have, a quality that is different from curiosity, that carries within it the suggestion of a decision being made. The casque rose above the surrounding vegetation. The blue of the neck was almost luminous in the forest light. The bird was a female, which meant it was the larger of the two sexes. It meant the talons on those feet were at their most formidable, and it was between them and the rest of the trail. They stopped. They knew enough to know that running was the wrong response. Everything they had read, every sign at every trailhead, every park authority instruction said the same thing. Do not run. Stand still. Do not make sudden movements. Give the animal space. Back away slowly if you can. They tried to back away slowly. And that was when the second cassowary stepped out of the bush behind them. There is a particular quality to the realization that you are trapped. It is not quite like fear in the ordinary sense. It is more total than that, more clarifying. The mind strips away everything that isn't immediately relevant and focuses with a sharpness that you don't experience in ordinary life. The tourists described it later as a kind of calm that was actually just the absence of any option other than calm. There was nothing to panic about because panic would have achieved nothing. There was nowhere to go and nothing to do except stand exactly where they were and think very, very clearly. The second bird was smaller, a male, almost certainly, given its size. In cassowary society, it is the male who does the incubating and the chick rearing, and by late nesting season, a male cassowary with chicks nearby becomes one of the most dangerous animals you can encounter in the Australian bush. Not because he is larger or stronger than the female, but because the biological imperative driving him is as absolute as any force in nature. He will not weigh consequences. He will not calculate odds. He will simply act, in defense of whatever he is protecting, with everything he has. The tourists didn't know, standing on that path, whether there were chicks nearby. They didn't know if this was a mated pair moving through shared territory, or a female defending a feeding area from a subordinate male, or some other dynamic they couldn't read from where they stood. What they knew was that there was a large armed bird in front of them and a slightly smaller but still formidable one behind them, and that both birds were aware of them and that neither bird was moving away. The forest didn't pause for this. Around them the sounds continued without interruption. Insects, birds, the distant percussion of something moving through the canopy above. Life went on at every level of the ecosystem, indifferent to the drama playing out on the path below. That indifference is one of the most powerful things about a place like the Daintree. It doesn't care what happens to you. It has no interest in your outcome. You are a very recent arrival in a very old world, and the world was complete without you. The male bird behind them took a step forward. In the language of cassowary behavior, this is a significant communication. A cassowary at rest is one thing. A cassowary in motion toward you is something else. They can cover ground with a speed that is genuinely startling the first time you see it. That long-strided run that in an adult can hit 50 kilometers per hour over short distances. You cannot outrun one on open ground. On a narrow jungle path, boxed in by vegetation on both sides, the idea of outrunning one is not worth considering. The woman reached slowly for her walking pole, not to use as a weapon but to hold it out horizontally, to make herself look wider, to create a visual impression of greater size. This is one of the recommended strategies in the event of a cassowary confrontation. Make yourself look as large as possible without making sudden threatening gestures. Hold something, a bag, a jacket, a pole, out in front of you as a barrier. If the bird attacks, put the largest available object between yourself and it. Get behind a tree if you can. Do not turn your back. She extended the pole slowly, horizontally, across her body. The male bird stopped. For a moment, nobody moved. The three of them, 2 humans and a bird, held a perfect stillness on the forest path, while the female ahead continued to regard them with that flat, measuring gaze, and the world went about its business around all of them. This is the thing about cassowary encounters that tends to get lost when people recount them, either because it complicates a narrative that is easier to tell as pure terror, or because it is genuinely difficult to articulate. For all their danger, for all the very real physical threat that a cassowary represents, these birds are not irrational. They are not mindlessly aggressive. They are animals with a sophisticated behavioral repertoire, animals that read situations and respond to them, that give signals before they act, that are, in most circumstances, more interested in going about their business than in conflict with the strange, smooth, upright creatures who keep appearing on their paths. The female cassowary, the larger bird ahead of them, made a sound. It was low, almost subsonic, felt more than heard, a rumble that seemed to come from somewhere in the chest and travel outward through the ground as much as through the air. Cassowaries produce sounds at frequencies well below what the human ear can comfortably resolve. They are among the few birds capable of generating infrasound, low-frequency vibrations that travel long distances through dense forest. This vocalization is used in a variety of communicative contexts. It can signal territorial ownership, it can communicate between mates, it can be a warning, it can be the sound that precedes an attack. The 2 tourists did not know which of these it was. They stood their ground. The female took a step to the right. Just one step, small, deliberate, a lateral movement that took her partially off the center of the path. It was not a retreat, but it was a shift, and in animal encounters, shifts matter. They are information. They tell you something about the state of the animal's decision-making. The male behind them moved too, not toward them this time, but sideways, melting back into the vegetation at the edge of the path, with a silence that seemed impossible for something his size. Not gone, still there, but not directly behind them anymore. The woman kept the pole extended. The man beside her didn't move. They both waited. What followed was 7 minutes. They counted. 7 minutes of standing on a rainforest path while the larger female cassowary regarded them from approximately 5 meters away, occasionally shifting her weight, occasionally tilting that great cascade head, occasionally producing more of that low, thrumming infrasound. 7 minutes during which neither of them spoke above a whisper, and both of them breathed with a care and a deliberateness that they had never before applied to the act of breathing. And then the female moved, not at them, not aggressively. She simply stepped off the path entirely, pushed into the undergrowth with that practiced, fluid ease, and was gone. Not quickly, not with any visible urgency. She simply concluded whatever she had been doing on the path and left, the way any large, unchallenged animal leaves a situation it no longer considers worth engaging with. The male was already gone. Neither of them had seen him leave. They stood there for another full minute before either of them moved. Then they walked, quickly but without running, back along the path they had come from, in the direction that was now clear, and they did not stop until they were back at the trailhead. They sat on a bench by the information board, and neither of them said anything for a long time. Later, speaking to a wildlife ranger, they would learn several things that made the encounter even more significant in retrospect. The trail they had been on ran through a known cassowary territory. The area had been marked in ranger records as one of frequent sightings. The female they had encountered was a known individual, a bird that rangers had been monitoring for several years, one with a long history of sightings on and near that specific trail section. And she had chicks. Not visible, not on the path, but somewhere in the vegetation nearby, a brood of striped chicks, already several weeks old but still under her loose protection. The male they had encountered from behind was, almost certainly, the same male who had incubated those eggs, the same bird whose biological programming runs hottest when anything unfamiliar approaches the area where his offspring are moving. The rangers told them they had done the right things, not running, making themselves look larger, standing their ground, being patient, all of it. But they also told them something else, something that sits at the heart of every serious conversation about cassowary safety and about human interaction with wildlife, in the Daintree more broadly. The thing that makes cassowary encounters increasingly dangerous is not the cassowary, it is the human context that has changed around it. There are fewer than 4,000 southern cassowaries left in the wild. Some estimates put the number significantly lower than that. The species is listed as endangered in Australia, and the primary drivers of that endangerment are not mysterious or difficult to identify. Habitat clearing has fragmented the rainforest that cassowaries need into smaller and smaller patches, forcing birds into closer proximity to roads, farmland, and human settlement. Vehicle strikes kill a significant number every year. Dogs attack and kill birds in suburban fringe areas where rainforest meets residential development. And then there is the problem that every wildlife authority in the Daintree region will tell you is growing worse and more difficult to manage. People feed them. It seems harmless, even generous. A cassowary appears at the edge of a trail, and a tourist holds out a piece of fruit. The bird takes it. The tourist feels they have experienced something magical, a connection with a wild animal. A photograph is taken. The encounter is posted, celebrated, shared. And the cassowary learns. It learns that humans carry food. It learns that approaching humans produces rewards. It loses, incrementally, the wariness that keeps it and the humans around it safe. It begins to associate people not with something to be avoided, but with something to be sought out. And a cassowary that has been fed, that has lost its natural distance from human beings, that has learned to approach and expect, is a far more dangerous animal than one that has spent its life keeping to the forest interior and treating every human encounter as a reason to leave. Most of the serious cassowary incidents recorded in far north Queensland in recent decades involve birds that have been habituated to human contact. Not all of them. The wild birds, the unhabituated ones in the deep forest, the ones that have had minimal human contact, those birds generally don't attack unless cornered, provoked, or defending young. They give ground, they move away. They use that extraordinary capacity for invisibility and simply disappear. It is the birds on the fringes, the ones who have spent time near campgrounds and picnic areas and roadsides, the ones who have been fed, the ones who have come to associate human presence with food or with conflict. Those are the birds that have injured people. But even an unhabituated wild cassowary, cornered on a narrow path with no exit and chicks in the surrounding bush, is capable of responding in a way that you will not recover from quickly. This is what those two tourists understood by the time they sat down on that bench at the trailhead. Not that they had encountered a monster, not that the Daintree was a place to be feared and avoided, but that they had been inside something ancient and complete and governed by rules that had nothing to do with human comfort or human expectation, and that they had gotten out of it not because the forest was merciful, but because they were lucky enough to have done the right things in the right order at the right time. There is a different texture to luck when you understand how close it was. The Daintree has a particular relationship with the concept of time that influences everything inside it. When scientists describe the forest as ancient, they do not mean simply that it has been here a long time. They mean that the processes operating within it have continuity with processes that extend back through geological time in an essentially unbroken line. The plants here are related to plants from the Gondwanan supercontinent. The families, not the species, but the families of plants have been evolving in this place, or in its predecessors, since Australia was part of the Great Southern Landmass, since the Southern Ocean did not exist, since Antarctica was forested and warm. The rainforest has survived ice ages, continental drift, sea level changes of tens of meters, the mass extinction event that ended the dinosaurs. It has survived because it is not a fragile thing. It is an enormously complex, enormously resilient system that has adapted to every catastrophe thrown at it by absorbing the shock and rebuilding. And the cassowary has been part of that system for nearly all of its modern history. The ratites, the family of flightless birds to which the cassowary belongs alongside the emu, the kiwi, the ostrich, and the rhea, diverged from flying ancestors perhaps 100 million years ago. The southern cassowary, as we know it today, is a more recent evolution, but its lineage in the rainforests of what is now northern Australia and New Guinea is deep and continuous. It did not arrive here. It developed here. The forest and the bird have been in dialogue for so long that they are, in a very meaningful sense, part of the same thing. The bird's digestive system is shaped by the forest's fruits. The forest structure is partly shaped by where the bird deposits its seeds. They are not separate entities with a relationship. They are one system with two components. Walking into the Daintree with a camera and a water bottle and a trail map, you are walking into that system from the outside. You are a visitor with no ecological role, no niche, no function that the system requires or accommodates. The forest doesn't notice you. The cassowary notices you because you are large and unfamiliar and potentially threatening, and its response to large, unfamiliar, potentially threatening things has been refined over millions of years into exactly the behavior that those two tourists encountered. Stand and assess. Communicate through sound and body posture. Escalate only if necessary. The remarkable thing, when you look at cassowary behavior in detail, is not how often they attack. It is how patient they are, how much they prefer to let the situation resolve without conflict. How many hundreds and thousands of encounters between cassowaries and humans in the Daintree have ended with the bird simply walking away, the drama building in a human heart that the bird was barely engaged with. There is a record kept by the Queensland Parks and Wildlife Service of cassowary incidents. Not just attacks, but all incidents, all reported encounters, all the times a ranger received a call from a tourist who had seen a bird on a trail and not known what to do. The data, when you look at it, tells a story about proximity and habituation, and the specific conditions that turn a passive encounter into a dangerous one. Distance matters. Birds encountered at a distance of more than 10 meters almost always simply move away. Birds encountered at close range, especially on narrow trails where neither the bird nor the human has room to give way comfortably, are significantly more likely to stand their ground. Birds in areas where feeding by tourists is common are more likely to approach, and approach behaviors, even apparently benign ones, can escalate unpredictably. Birds with chicks or eggs are in a categorically different behavioral state and should be treated as such regardless of every other factor. The cassowary does not want to hurt you. That is the baseline truth. It wants to eat fruit and walk through the forest and do the work of dispersing seeds that the rainforest has depended on it to do for longer than our species has existed. Your presence in its world is an interruption, an inconvenience at best, and a threat at worst, and it will respond to you accordingly. If you give it space, it will almost always take that space and use it to put distance between itself and you. If you take that space away, if you corner it on a path, or approach it too closely, or crowd it, or try to feed it, or try to get a close-up photograph, you have changed the equation in a way that is not to your advantage. There is a section of the Daintree coast, a stretch of rainforest fringing the shoreline between the Daintree River crossing and Cape Tribulation, where the cassowary population is particularly dense by contemporary standards, and where tourists are most likely to encounter them. The birds move along the shore in the mornings and evenings, particularly during fruit-fall seasons, and they cross roads and trails with a regularity that has made them both beloved and dangerous emblems of the region. Signs along the roads warn drivers, bright yellow signs with the silhouette of a cassowary in mid-stride. Visitor centers at the resort areas give briefings. Rangers patrol the known hotspots, and still, every year, there are incidents, some minor, some not. The thing that rangers will tell you, the thing that goes beyond all the practical safety advice and gets to something harder to communicate, but more important, is this. The Daintree is not a zoo. The cassowary is not an attraction. The rainforest does not exist for your experience of it. These are obvious statements, almost embarrassingly obvious, and yet they run counter to something deep in the way that many visitors approach natural spaces. They run counter to the expectation that nature will present itself to you at a scale and intensity that you can manage, that it will be beautiful without being threatening, that it will be wild without being truly dangerous, that you can walk into an ancient rainforest in the far north of Australia and feel connected to something primordial without actually having to reckon with what primordial means. Primordial means the cassowary has been here for 60 million years and you have been here for an afternoon. Primordial means the rules that govern this space were written long before you arrived and will continue long after you've left. Primordial means that the bird standing on the path in front of you, regarding you with those small, golden, utterly serious eyes, is not performing for you, is not impressed by you, is not aware of the photograph you want to take, or the story you want to tell, or the experience you came here to have. It is simply an animal in its own world, attending to its own life, and you have walked into the middle of it. Those two tourists understood this in the 7 minutes they stood on that path, not as an abstract principle, not as something they had read in a guidebook, but as a physical, visceral, cell-deep understanding. The kind of understanding that comes from standing in the presence of something genuinely powerful in its own environment, on its own terms, with no barrier between you. They told the ranger afterward that they weren't angry, they weren't shaken in the way they expected to be. They were, if anything, deeply and unexpectedly moved, because what they had felt on that path, beneath the fear, beneath the survival calculus, beneath all of it, was something rarer in modern life than almost anything else. They had felt, absolutely, and without any ambiguity, that they were not at the center of the world, that the world was larger than them, and older than them, and would continue without them, and that the bird in front of them was not a danger to that world, but a part of it, an essential, irreplaceable, magnificent part of it. And that is, perhaps, the most important thing the cassowary teaches. Not how to survive an encounter, though that knowledge matters. Not how dangerous birds can be, though they can be very dangerous indeed. What the cassowary teaches, if you are quiet enough and still enough to learn it, is that you are a guest in a world that was never yours, moving through an ecosystem that was complete before you arrived and will be diminished by your carelessness, and that the price of not understanding this is paid not by you alone but by the whole, intricate, ancient, irreplaceable living system that you walked into. The Daintree has lost forest. It continues to lose forest, more slowly now than in previous decades, but the pressure does not stop. Every hectare converted from rainforest to farmland or residential development is a piece of cassowary habitat removed from the system. And because cassowaries are territorial, because they need large ranges to find enough food, because they cannot simply compress themselves into smaller and smaller fragments of forest and maintain viable populations, every hectare matters. The population cannot absorb infinite loss. The ecological thresholds that govern what the forest can sustain are real, and they are finite. There are people in the Daintree region, in the communities that have grown up alongside this extraordinary forest, who understand the cassowary not as a threat but as a measure of the health of the system, a measure of the quality of what remains, a measure, in a way that few other species can offer, of whether the forest is still functioning in the way that it needs to. If the cassowaries are there, in the numbers they should be in the places they should be in, doing the work they have always done, then the forest is, broadly, okay. If they disappear from areas where they should be, if the numbers drop, if the birds are concentrated in ever smaller refuges, then something is wrong that goes well beyond the cassowary itself. Local conservation groups work with Queensland Parks and Wildlife to monitor the population, to track individual birds, to respond to injury cases, to manage the road strike problem with strategic fencing and underpasses, and speed zone modifications. Schools in the region teach children about cassowaries not as local curiosities, but as ecological pillars. The signs and the briefings and the ranger patrols are all part of a recognition, growing slowly but genuinely, that this bird matters in ways that a species count alone does not capture. There is a movement in wildlife conservation globally toward what is sometimes called coexistence. The idea that the answer to human-wildlife conflict is not to choose a winner, not to exclude humans from wildlife habitat, or to eliminate wildlife from human-used landscapes, but to find ways in which both can persist, both can function, both can move through the world with enough space and enough tolerance to maintain the integrity of what they each need. Coexistence is harder than either exclusion or elimination. It requires ongoing attention, ongoing negotiation, ongoing willingness to accept inconvenience and risk, and the complexity that comes with sharing space with other powerful living things. The Daintree is one of the places where that negotiation is most visible and most important. The tourists come because the forest is extraordinary. The forest is extraordinary partly because the cassowary has shaped it. The cassowary is still there because enough of the forest remains, and enough people have decided that its presence matters. The loop is not yet broken, but it is under pressure, and the pressure is constant. When those two tourists left the trailhead that day, they left differently than they had arrived. They had walked in with the confidence of people who had traveled to see something beautiful and expected to do so safely. They walked out with something more complicated, a knowledge that the safety they had assumed was conditional, that the beautiful thing they had come to see had its own interior life, and its own priorities, and its own power, and that their continued physical well-being had depended for 7 minutes on the patience of an animal that owed them nothing. They said they would go back. Both of them said it independently, to the ranger, without discussing it between themselves. They would go back to the Daintree. They would walk the trails again. They might even see a cassowary again, and they hoped they would. But they would go back differently than they had come the first time. More carefully, more humbly, with a clearer understanding of what the place actually is and what it asks of the people who enter it. That seems, when you sit with it, like the right response. Not fear, not avoidance, not the false confidence of someone who has read the safety guidelines and believes they have therefore managed the situation, but a genuine, calibrated respect, the kind that acknowledges that you are dealing with something older and more powerful than yourself, that the rules of that world are not your rules, and that the appropriate response to that recognition is attention, sustained, careful, humble attention. The cassowary does not ask for much from you. It asks for distance, it asks for restraint. It asks you not to feed it, not to approach it, not to crowd it on a narrow path with no way out. In exchange for those things which cost you very little, it will continue to do what it has done for 60 million years. It will walk through the forest. It will eat the fruit. It will carry the seeds. It will rebuild the understory. It will keep the forest being what it is. And occasionally, very occasionally, it will step out onto a path in front of you, and it will look at you with those ancient, serious eyes, and it will remind you of something you needed to be reminded of. That you are not at the center of this, that the world is larger than you, that this is a very good thing. The southern cassowary of far north Queensland is listed as endangered. Its population is declining. The threats to it are real and ongoing. If you have come away from this story wanting to do something beyond watching and thinking, then find out what is being done in the Daintree and who is doing it. The organizations working to preserve cassowary habitat, to reduce road strikes, to monitor the population, to educate communities and visitors, they are doing work that matters. Not just for one spectacular, dangerous ancient bird, but for the whole extraordinary system that bird has been tending since before our species existed. The forest is still there, the cassowaries are still moving through it, carrying seeds, shaping the understory, doing the long, patient work that the forest needs done. The path is still there, and somewhere along it, right now, a bird with blue skin and a casque of bone and 12-centimeter blades on its feet is stepping out of the undergrowth and finding the path empty and moving on into the forest and becoming invisible again. Pay attention to it while it's still there to see, because in the history of the earth, the window during which you can still do that is brief, and it is not guaranteed.